There are classified programs created to study the unknown. And then there are programs created to control it. But Project Helios belonged to the second category. According to insiders, suppressed documentation and contractor testimony never meant to leave secure rooms. Helios was an attempt to harness a form of energy recovered from crashed craft, technology that did not obey known laws of physics, thermodynamics, or causality. It was not solar, it was not nuclear, and it was not passive. By the time the program ended in the 1980s, dozens of personnel had been medically retired, entire facilities had been erased from federal records, and one conclusion had quietly circulated among those involved. The energy was not just powerful, it was aware. Project Helios did not emerge in isolation. It was born from the despair of the Cold War. By the late 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in an arms race that had escalated beyond weapons to the realm of existential threat. Nuclear weapons were advancing faster than diplomacy, and military planners understood a terrifying truth. The next war wouldn't be fought for territory. It would be fought for survival. Nuclear weapons, while devastating, had limitations. Finite fuel, infrastructure collapse, radioactive fallout. The Pentagon wanted something better. A power source that could operate indefinitely, function silently, and exist beyond the supply chain. They didn't publicly acknowledge that such a power source had already been found. Years before Helios was officially sanctioned, classified recovery teams had already retrieved non-human technological debris from several UFO incidents. Not entire craft were recovered, but fragments and components were. And among these fragments were compact units unlike anything in human engineering. Internal documents describe them as unique power units, self-contained energy sources. Privately, engineers called them cores. These devices exhibited a constant energy output. They produced no measurable heat, had no detectable fuel source, showed no decay over time, and resisted all attempts at disassembly. But attempts to scan them resulted in interference. An early report stated, "This device does not store energy. Rather, it accesses it." Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, a classified directive reached senior defense officials. The logic was simple and urgent. We were days away from annihilation. Energy security is national survival. The recovered cores were consolidated into a single, black-budget program under the authority of the Department of Defense, with intelligence compartmentalization overseen by the CIA. This project was named Helios. The name was symbolic, not because the energy came from the sun, but because its output rivaled stellar processes. Its behavior resembled plasma field dynamics, and its density exceeded atomic expectations. The official mission statement was deliberately vague: advanced energy research for strategic defense applications. The real mission was far simpler: to make it human controllable. The first Helios activation test took place in early 1964. The core was placed in a vacuum-isolated chamber surrounded by sensors. There was no ignition, there were no switches, there were no mechanical triggers. But as the containment fields stabilized, the chamber changed. Not brighter, not hotter, but different. The sensors recorded that a sudden disturbance in the magnetic field had occurred. Low-frequency harmonic signals began to be generated without any source. It's as if the room is being watched, but by someone else. Now, Helios was never a research project. It was an exploitation program. Therefore, the scientists were tasked not with understanding the core, but with copying its function. They attempted to reverse engineer the containment geometry, to replicate the field structure and harness that energy in a man-made housing. Do you think they succeeded? Of course they did. They were Americans, after all. America and the Soviet Union created all the weapons of mass destruction in the world. By the late 1960s, the prototypes were successful. Experimental units then began powering classified aerospace platforms, long-range radar systems, and underground installations. One prototype ran continuously for over 7 months. No fuel, no malfunctions. The military celebrated. They thought they had found an unlimited source of energy. But the scientists became increasingly uneasy. As output increased, its side effects became impossible to ignore. A measurable zone formed around the active units. Researchers dubbed it the HELIOS field. Inside this field, reality behaved strangely. Employees experienced temporal distortions, memory lapses. Several reported seeing geometric light structures, pulsating patterns, and feeling a presence. Medical teams found no radiation exposure, toxins, or neurological illness. An internal memo warned, "It does not harm the environment. Rather, it alters the environment." In 1966, HELIOS documented its first confirmed temporal anomaly. According to external instruments, a specific activation lasted 93 seconds. But inside the chamber, observers perceived approximately 68 seconds. Multiple clocks confirmed the discrepancy. It wasn't psychological, it was physical. A classified report concluded, containment should be considered space-time containment. What that meant, only the aliens knew. The report was later sealed. In March 1971, HELIOS reached a point of no return. A prototype was pushed beyond established safety limits. Security footage recorded a visual anomaly and the collapse of the surrounding energy field. And then, it vanished. The device didn't explode. It simply disappeared. The chamber remained intact, but sensors detected residual energy patterns for days. 3 technicians suffered irreversible neurological damage. One repeatedly drew the same unknown symbol. No linguist could identify it. At this point, HELIOS should have been shut down. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end of HELIOS. But it wasn't. Because the technology worked. A classified aircraft powered by a HELIOS-based system flew for months without refueling. The radar systems powered by these units were unaffected by electronic warfare. A decision was then made that the collateral damage was acceptable. By the mid-1970s, the mental state of HELIOS personnel was deteriorating. They began experiencing terrifying nightmares involving light and geometry. Several researchers reported the same fear. It's not harming us, or maybe it's learning us. Psychologists raised the alarm. They were removed from the program. By 1978, a disturbing theory emerged. What if the core generators weren't generators at all? What if they were interfaces? Some researchers believe the energy originated from a non-local source, possibly a higher dimensional system or non-human intelligence. Yes, I mean aliens. A classified document stated, "This system resists replication. It recognizes authenticity." In other words, it knew the difference between real and fake. In 1983, HELIOS attempted its final experiment. Instead of imposing control, scientists attempted resonance synchronization, aligning human systems with the energy's natural state. For 11 seconds, everything stabilized. And then, the chamber filled with harmonic tones. Personnel reported hearing voices without sound. Multiple systems failed simultaneously. One engineer was found repeating, "It's not ours." Project HELIOS was terminated weeks later. The facilities were sealed. The records were shredded. Personnel were reassigned, or they disappeared. Officially, Project HELIOS never existed. Unofficially, patents related to exotic energy modulation surfaced years later under unrelated corporate names. The technology survived, but the program did not. When Project HELIOS was shut down in 1983, the official story was straightforward. The program was too dangerous, Its technology was unstable, and its risks outweighed its benefits. So the facilities were sealed, the personnel were reassigned, the records were suppressed. But classified programs don't really end. They splinter. And when HELIOS ended, its most dangerous discovery didn't disappear. It simply went quiet. Between 1984 and 1989, something strange happened within the American Defense Research System. Entire project files vanished. Not declassified, not archived, but removed. Former HELIOS employees later described a coordinated dismantling. Labs were emptied overnight. Equipment was moved without inventory. Research teams were broken up and reassigned to unrelated divisions. Several scientists abruptly resigned. Others accepted long-term consulting contracts with private defense firms. Some simply disappeared from public record. No obituaries, no employment history, no trace. HELIOS wasn't erased. It was dispersed. In the early 1990s, a strange pattern emerged. Patents began appearing, filed by private companies with deep military ties, describing technologies that shouldn't have been possible at the time. They mentioned exotic field containment, non-chemical energy generation, space-time modulation effects. But former HELIOS researchers immediately recognized the geometry. These patents didn't describe new inventions. They described partial reconstructions, filed under code names, with identities concealed, funding sources removed. HELIOS had gone private. By the mid-1990s, insiders began whispering about new names. Not HELIOS itself, but projects that bore its mark. Former analysts said that the projects that followed HELIOS were given only one instruction: don't provoke the system. Whoever had interacted with HELIOS had learned their lesson. In the late 1990s, strange readings began to reappear, but not at the old HELIOS sites, rather all over the world. Military sensor arrays briefly registered electromagnetic disturbances, localized gravity anomalies, and radar contacts with no physical signature, whose patterns were familiar, very familiar. They almost perfectly matched the archived HELIOS field signatures. But this time, no devices were active. A classified theory, never formally written down, began circulating among defense analysts. It was called the Watcher hypothesis. According to this theory, the recovered cores weren't power sources, they were anchors, an interface. HELIOS hadn't extracted energy. Instead, it had established contact with us. In recent years, the military has acknowledged encountering objects that defy conventional propulsion principles. Objects that emit no exhaust and distort space-time around them. For the veterans of Project HELIOS, these characteristics were instantly recognizable, not because of the craft themselves, but because of their field effects. The same anomalies, the same peculiarities, the same impossible signatures. Whatever was powering those objects, HELIOS had touched it decades earlier. HELIOS didn't leave behind a weapon, it left behind knowledge. Knowledge that energy can be intelligent, technology can observe its users. Some systems exist beyond proprietary control, and perhaps most disturbing, that humanity was being watched. Not when we developed nuclear weapons, not when we went to space, but when we attempted to steal a power that was never dormant. Project HELIOS is over, but the conversation it started remains unresolved. If the energy source was alien, if it was intelligent, then HELIOS wasn't a failure, it was an introduction.